One bad decision can truly ruin how a character is looked at by the fans forever. I think we see this most prevalently with Deathstroke, but there are a few other characters that fall into this similar vein of a terrible writing decision has come to define them in the minds of many comic book fans, moviegoers, and just people that genuinely enjoy these characters or these stories. And I wanted to present a kind of wide range of how this one bad decision has damaged the reputation of a character. So we have the more extreme end with Deathstroke, and what is in my opinion the less extreme end of Hal Jordan. He as well has a decision that came to define him for a while, a very poor decision, but ultimately he's been able to kind of escape the reputation associated with that decision. And then you land somewhere in the middle with Hank Pym, in my opinion, and his whole situation with his wife. And by situation, I mean that they made him a spousal abuser. I'm a minute into the video, I can say that now, I think. Deathstroke was created in the 1980s to be one of the Teen Titans' main antagonists going forward. It makes a decent amount of sense, and the dude is really cool, he's a contract killer. The idea behind Deathstroke is amazing. And the way in which he gets used in a lot of modern comic books tends to be pretty cool. He slides into this slot that's almost close to being an anti-hero, but really still just being a villain place. And he tends to have these really fun and interesting stories, and even during events like New 52, I still found myself enjoying the character and enjoying his books. But at the back of my mind each and every time, as I read a Deathstroke book or saw his new suit coming to live action, or just anything surrounding the character, I was like, damn, this dude likes kids. That is the first thought that is pervasive in my mind when I think of Deathstroke, is the fact that he is a child predator. And that decision was made in arguably one of the most popularized Teen Titans comic book runs ever in Judas Contract. It's one of the most adapted versions of the character of not only Deathstroke, but also one of the most adapted stories for the Teen Titans in general. And considering how popular the Teen Titans have been throughout my entire life, I've seen at least 2 adaptations of Judas Contract. And unfortunately, with every adaptation of that, they always bring up one of the worst decisions made for Deathstroke as a character, and that was the fact that he was sleeping with Tara, a 15-year-old girl, a mentally unstable 15-year-old girl. And you don't want to know what the greatest kicker for all of this is? Was that this wasn't supposed to be an indictment on Deathstroke the character himself. As a matter of fact, the creators of Deathstroke, and Tara as well, had initially planned for this to be a poor reflection on Tara. Yes, this was supposed to make Tara look terrible. It's supposed to make her look bad and evil and like this horrible person. It was supposed to be like an inverse of Kitty Pryde. It was supposed to show us that actually Tara was evil all along and she wasn't being manipulated. No. She was making these choices herself and she was always bad. And the best way to show that is to have her sleeping with like a 40 to 60-year-old adult man and smoking cigarettes, because that makes the most sense at the time. I'm still baffled by this decision to this day, especially with what they were going for, because to me it just cements how evil and unstable Deathstroke is as a person rather than Tara. And now this will sit as a stain on Deathstroke as a character's repertoire forever, because nobody really looks at him the same. And that's specifically because it's not necessarily helped by DC themselves. They continually bring up Judas Contract. They continually bring up what he did to Tara. And so there will be no sweeping this under the rug for his character. He will be forever intertwined with this decision that wasn't meant to affect him as much as it was meant to affect Tara. Which again, just a horrible writing decision all around. And like, why are we victim blaming Tara in this situation to show her as quote unquote more evil? Like, that's horrible. She's the victim in that situation of an elderly man. He don't look elderly because of the serum, but he's an elderly man taking advantage of a 15-year-old girl, and it's horrible. And because DC continues to acknowledge it, continues to bring it up, and continues to include it in his character, and obviously with Judas Contract being as popular as it is, we continue to see like adaptations of this story, all including that bit because it is very important to the story. Deathstroke is never going to live down this one bad decision, and it will forever taint how a lot of people look at him. With the other characters I'm going to bring up today, you can argue that it's kind of unfair to continuously bring this up and to poke fun and poke holes at the character because of this one bad writing decision that tends to be pretty out of character. But you can't really make that argument with Deathstroke because DC continues to bring it up again and again and again, even in comic books that don't involve Judas Contract, and in all of the adaptations of Judas Contract. They are constantly bringing to the forefront that this is a main aspect of Deathstroke's character. And in doing so, I can't really say it's unfair to bring this up and criticize the character on, because every time I see him in any form of media, the first thing that jumps to my mind is, damn, he loves to touch them kids. Hashtag release the Legion of Doom files. Anyways, it's just kind of frustrating because Deathstroke at his core is like a pretty cool character and his designs are always peak. I mean, whether it's from the more armored designs to the more cloth costume looks, he always looks pretty cool. But he'll never escape this kind of reputation. And while Deathstroke might not be able to escape his fate as being a child predator and viewed that way by the fandom, Hank Pym is kind of in this weird state of limbo in which, sure, his stigma as a wife beater is not a good thing, but Marvel has not done anything to help Hank Pym's character outside of that because he's pretty much been sidelined since like 1979. Outside of a few pretty damn good adaptations in like Earth's Mightiest Heroes, for example, Hank Pym has pretty much been out of the cultural mind when it comes to comic book fans for a long time. And I know there are a lot of Hank Pym fans, but he hasn't really been the mainline Ant-Man in a very long time. As a matter of fact, he's pretty much been out of comic books for the last decade, from like 2015 until 2025. And part of that is, he wasn't a big part of the MCU. A lot of people mistake that the reason Hank wasn't billed as the main man for the MCU as Ant-Man was because he beat his wife, but rather it more or less had to do with directorial decisions. Basically, Wright really wanted to tell a legacy aspect of the character rather than just do Hank. He also wanted to tell a story of Ant-Man, Scott Lang, and his daughter. He wanted to go in a different direction. Had it been a different director, we might have been able to actually see Hank Pym. I don't think it all fundamentally falls back on his wife beater story. And as for mainline Hank Pym, it's not even that big of a story aspect for his character. They were trying their best to show what happens with mental illness and how it can affect those around you, and show that this was Hank Pym lashing out at those around him. And I think it was a really piss poor way of doing it, because while it created a great short-term shock value, when it comes to a long-term viewing of a character like Hank Pym, people are going to latch on to the fact that he beat his wife. But that was back in the 70s for mainline Hank, and he hasn't done anything to repeat that action unless you're reading the Ultimates comics. Once again, I get to sit here and dunk on my introduction to Marvel from when I was a child, because in the Ultimate comics, Hank doesn't just beat Janet, he brutalizes her. That does not make what 616 Hank did good or reasonable or any better. It is still spousal abuse. I want to make this very, very clear. What he did is wrong, what he did is reprehensible, and what he did should have never happened in the first place. I just want to make that very clear as I'm editing this video. It's not a backhanded slap more than it is, I'm going to actively try and kill you. It is one of the most hard to read panels I've ever read. And I read this, I was like 6 or 7, because the PX used to have the Ultimates comics on discount because they were a few years older, and the soldiers really seemed to enjoy them, or at least that's what my dad used to say. And so I used to get them as a kid, and God, they were such terrible reads. And as an introduction to Marvel, not great. A little tangent over, Hank Pym in those comics was a real abuser. He was a drunk, an abuser, and a miserable person to be around in general. And that's, I feel like, more where Hank got that stamp of being an abuser rather than the mentally ill man we know from Marvel's 616 comic books. And in my opinion, mainline Hank is kind of unfairly shackled with the being of an abuser and a domestic abuser specifically, rather than being somebody with severe mental illness whom the writers chose to show that off in a really shitty way. Now, Ultimate's Hank is for sure an abuser. And when you look at main 616 Hank and a lot of his adaptations, none of them ever choose to include him hitting his wife. This is completely unlike Deathstroke, who it seems to be a recurring theme that he likes kids. This is far and away not recurring for Hank's character. And so in my opinion, I just kind of write it off as being retconned and not really being a thing for modern Hank. But Marvel never did him any favors by excluding him from one of their biggest things ever in the MCU, excluding him as a main character. He was a character, but he was more of a mentor role. And pretty much sidelining him in the comic books as mainline Ant-Man for a very long time, and then sidelining him as a character in general for the last decade. It hasn't done a whole lot to help how people view him as a character. Unlike for Deathstroke, I do feel that 616 Hank's tendency to be labeled as an abuser just feels wrong. It feels like pretty unfair in the ideal of like, it was one story and it was one poor decision that the writers made for this character to show that he was mentally unwell. And forevermore, he's pretty much stuck with this whole I'm an abuser thing, even if most modern adaptations don't even bother to include it, because it's just not well written and it's just not inside of Hank's character. And you can say this a lot about a lot of other characters. One of the ones that comes to mind for me in Marvel specifically is Mr. Fantastic. If you read the comic book Civil War, you would think that man has no care for anything but science and being right, and that he's straight up evil. But if you read any of his actual comic books, any of the actual Fantastic Four comic books, he's just a deeply intelligent but deeply loving man to his family, just in his own kind of way. Again, I think Hank gets it a little bit unfairly, but Marvel hasn't helped him at all by pretty much sidelining him since the event happened. And this leads us to Hal Jordan, a character that has mostly been able to like skirt around the allegations of being a child lover and pretty much has been able to go on about living their normal life, because 99.9% of Green Lantern fans just like to pretend this run didn't exist. And so does DC. Now, if you're wondering what I'm talking about, in case you haven't heard of this, because some people really haven't, it's not nearly as prevalent, I'm talking about Arisa Robb. It was a 13-year-old Green Lantern who subconsciously used her Power Rings power to age her up into being an adult both mentally and physically. Wow, this is starting to really read like one of those animes where it's like the protagonist is isekai'd into a world where all of the women are like 13 years old, but like they swear they're 3,000 but they look 13. Jesus, who wrote this? Who wrote this story? Anyways, she was aged up to be an adult, and then Hal, even though he knew that she was a kid and now knows that she aged herself to be an adult, decided to start dating her. And they dated for a while. Even after she lost her powers, Hal continued to date her because she was still like an adult, I guess. I don't know, this whole situation is really weird. Like, I don't know why anybody thought this was a good idea. I'm sorry. This is horrible. Sorry, I just had to take a moment to collect myself, because genuinely reading through this it's so stupid. Either way, the two of them lived on Earth and she became a model. Hal Jordan and her eventually break up. She regresses into being mentally a 13-year-old after the Green Lantern Citadel is destroyed. I cannot believe I just read that. Again, this kind of reads like a writer's poorly disguised fetish, but a lot of comic books are like that, and to nobody's surprise, it comes from the 80s, so are we really that surprised, guys? 70s with Hank, 80s with Deathstroke. Are we really that surprised? But you see, unlike Marvel, DC likes to do these hard resets, and when they do hard resets, they tend to ignore a lot of the more problematic histories of certain characters. So for Hal, they just straight up omitted this entire thing even happening. And Hal also gets the benefit of being included in a lot of great storylines, both before and after this event, as well as the fact that DC just willfully ignores the event. They're basically running Hal's greatest PR team ever, and they simply just chose to ignore that this happened and move on, which is the correct choice when it comes to a decision like this, because it's so wildly out of pocket for Hal. And I mean, I've probably showed this already on screen, but like you're not looking good when you have to say and write this, "I have to show them I'm not a child molester." Why would you even write this? Sometimes you just gotta laugh, because it's so absurd that this is what this is the landmark decision you'd make with one of your most popular characters in Hal Jordan. Now, I won't sit here and lie to you and pretend like Hal Jordan's my favorite Green Lantern, because he's not. I'm really a fan of like pre-DCAU John Stewart. I really love Jessica Cruz, and I've just, like, Hal's always been there. I've kind of liked Guy more, but it's never been because of this decision with the character, and typically this decision doesn't stick unless somebody is really just trying to be an asshole about your favorite Green Lantern. And Hal, again, he had the benefit of DC having crisis events, DC choosing to move on, and he also had the benefit of, like, people, like, writers just ignored that this happened, and they moved on with the character. They didn't do a Slade Wilson where they kept it around and made it a really big thing for him, or a Marvel where they shelved the character forever. No, Hal Jordan kind of got shelved for different reasons, typically stemming from, again, the huge popularity of Jon Stewart, even though I would argue his DCAU version, well, the most popular is the worst, but that's a video for another day. Either way though, Hal mostly escaped this. But do you want to know a character that fully escaped this fate? Iron Man. One of the worst writing decisions in history was to put Iron Man on the side of pro-registration in Civil War. That entire storyline is honestly character assassination for anybody who sided with the pro-registration side. And especially so for, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Fantastic, but Iron Man. He acts so wildly out of character throughout the entire book, and it's absolutely abhorrent the way in which they treated him as a character. And that was my first real introduction to Iron Man, was Civil War. And for years, I didn't like the dude, and I still am on the fence about how much I like Iron Man in the comics, partly because my introduction was Civil War. And the worst part about this is, I know it was written out of character. I know it is wrong, but that was my first viewing of the character, and that pretty much helps shape how a lot of comic book fans will see a character. So if their first introduction to Slade is Judas Contract, that's gonna stick forever. Iron Man got to escape this fate far better than any of the other characters I brought up today, because of the MCU and how wildly popular Robert Downey Jr.'s interpretation of Iron Man was. He took a B-list character and elevated him to S+ tier levels of popularity through the movie, and helped to redefine how Iron Man would be written and continue to be written going forward, even if sometimes he gets stuck with, like, a superior Iron Man storyline. But rather, going forward, the character was drastically changed. That one bad decision didn't have to define the character because Marvel went out of their way to make it not define the character. And ultimately, it did wonders for Tony as a character. It was really great to see him move on from Civil War, in which he was hated by a lot of comic book readers. He was not exactly that popular at the time of the decision of Civil War. And so through actively writing better stories afterwards and kind of just sweeping this one under the rug and sparingly mentioning it, we moved on from the effects of that story on his character, and he continues to thrive today. What I've been trying to get at through all of this video is just the simple explanation that If you want a character to move on from one bad decision and for them to not be ruined by it, you either have to force them to confront that issue and why it was wrong, something like an Emma Frost level of character rebalancing and, I guess, maturity of a character, in which you make them face every single one of the wrong decisions that they have made and try to make amends for them going forward, or you simply ignore it and you move on. Because at the end of the day, one horrible decision can ruin a character for a certain amount of people, but it doesn't have to. There's always a way out of it. It just depends on whether or not the company and the executives that are running these books care enough to write a good enough story to get these characters away from their moniker. I don't think Slade is ever going to beat the allegations of liking children, because in every iteration of him, it tends to creep up, except for like the Arrowverse or the Snyderverse, but we never got far enough, and I wouldn't have put it past Zack Snyder to definitely make him into kids. Either way though, Hank Pym is a great example of just kind of moving on by forgetting, by abandoning the character. Hal Jordan is a great example of moving on by writing better stories, and he got sidelined for completely different reasons. Ironman is the ultimate example of moving on by writing better stories, by repositioning how the character is functioning, and by not assassinating them at random times with terrible writing. Except for the few times that they've done that already again, but hey, it's comic books. What are you gonna do? It just kind of happens. So yes, one bad decision can ruin a character, but it doesn't have to be permanent and it doesn't have to be forever, unless editorial wants it to be. Alright, it's about that time. If you like the video and want to sub, those two things help the channel out a lot. If you dislike the video, please leave me some constructive criticism in the comments so I can be a better creator for all of you. I have a Patreon, which for $1 a month, you can see these videos without all the changes that I have to make to avoid YouTube's copyright system. It's $1 a month if you want to support. You'll be going above and beyond for me, and I truly appreciate it as a creator. And if you're in the $5 or above tier, I shout your name out at the end of each and every one of my videos. So without further ado, shout out Athena, shout out Ethan, shout out The Real Medusa, Gramir, David Barry, Kane Kent, John, Demetrius Youngblood, Metal Monk, Wes, Oscar, McGann, Esabert13, Gabriel Lafonte, Video Gamer 75, Dakota Ross, and Donovan Gomez, and MC Bomb 27. You all are amazing. Hope you'll have an absolutely fantastic day.